instructions and learn something, hopefully, about the environment. All right? So what does it mean to learn here? Every player tracks a vector of perceptions, their beliefs, if you want, about the value of each action B, okay, of each bid. These perceptions are what guides their perceived utility. Okay? So in principle, this should be exactly the expected utility from playing a particular bid B plus a term that accounts for what happens in the future, right? Continuation value. Okay? So if you ever seen a Markov decision problem, this is the optimal value function. Okay? And gamma here is the discount rate, is how much weight do you put on the future, right? I'm going to always think about gamma being pretty high. Okay? So no need. You can put gamma to 0. This is a stateless problem, right? If you want to add states, if you want to start thinking about more complicated settings, then that is useful to have there, and that's why. Okay. Good. So
sorry to keep bugging you. So this B negative I, right? Are you assuming player I has a model of the other player?
Not at all. So when I say B here, this is really just yours.
Yeah.
In fact, you're misspecified, right? This QB doesn't really exist unless you take expectations over the strategy of the opponent.
Right. So are you going to talk about that? Are you assuming each player has the expectations over the other opponent with respect to what distribution?
Not at all. So they carry a number that they associate with a particular bid, right? Hopefully that expectation gets embedded in there, right? In the way that they compute this number, but they don't have any information about it.
Got it.
Yeah. Thank you. Awesome. So this is the ideal Q, right? This is the ideal perception, the belief. But players need to figure this Q out. They need to learn it. And so what they were going to do is they're going to estimate these perceptions using the following formula. Essentially, the formula says that you combine in a convex way your previous period's perception, what you thought yesterday about the payoffs, plus what you observed today by playing that action B. Okay? So yesterday I thought this action was going to give me 5. I play it. Today I learned that it's actually 4. So I'm going to do a convex combination between 5 and 4. That's my new perception. Okay? Alpha is the parameter of that convex combination. It's essentially a measure of persistence. Is how much weight do I want to give to past experience? Okay? You can think of alpha being pretty small means that past experience matters a lot and it takes a while to learn. Okay, so perceptions are an ideal value, but I haven't told you how the agent actually chooses actions, right? The agent here now has a way to think about what action it should take, but I didn't tell you how it chooses. So the policy I'm going to think about is called epsilon greedy. The greedy part is an agent choosing the bid that he thinks is the best one at time t. Okay? He's choosing the argmax of this Q vector. Right? He's choosing the bid that maximizes his expectations. Right? This happens with large probability, 1 minus epsilon. So he's exploiting, right, the information that he has up to the point t. However, with some small probability, the agent must explore to figure out whether his perceptions are correct or not. All right? So when he explores, it chooses a bid, B at random. Right? That allows him to learn something about bidding that particular number and update his own perceptions. Good? Awesome. So this is what I mean when I say algorithms. So let's see how these algorithms perform. All right? So I'm going to show you 2 plots. One for the first price auction and one for the second price auction, where these algorithms are playing instead of rational Alice and Bob. All right. You remember the game matrix, right? Is going to be a 19 by 19. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you another 19 by 19 picture, one here for the second price, one over there for the first price. And I'm going to show you the frequency of play in each of these little squares. Okay, so I'm going to tell you exactly how often agents play in a particular square. Okay. In the long run, yes. You can think, I think I have it in the slide, but it's something like millions of simulations. You look at the last 100,000 periods. Once they learned, right? Once they figured it out. This is the second price auction. They're learning exactly the equilibrium. That's great, right? These algorithms are learning to play the right thing. They're figuring out how to be competitive. In the first price auction, there's almost 0 mass on the Nash equilibrium. These agents are playing symmetric strategies. So they're playing the same bid most of the time, right? Not necessarily the same pair of bids. So they might be playing 10 cents, 10 cents sometimes, but also 15 cents, 15 cents some other time. The important point is they never play 95 cents. They're getting a really great deal on these impressions, right? Some could say they're colluding, okay? Somehow they're managed to keep under competitive bids in what should be a fairly competitive market. This doesn't happen in the second price auction. So these are 1,000 simulations, right? I look at what the outcome is on each of these simulations. What is that they learn to play across after a million periods. Okay. So, of course, these agents are exploring with some probability epsilon, and I didn't tell you this, but epsilon is falling down, right? I explore less and less the more time goes on. So you may wonder, well, maybe what's happening is that they get stuck somewhere, right? They get stuck in 10 cents, 15 cents that they can get out. But they eventually should learn that 10 cents is not optimal. When my opponent is bidding 10, I should be bidding 15, and I should be good. Okay? So it turns out, even if I keep exploration up forever, these agents never learn Nash equilibrium. Okay? So I'm running this simulation for 100 million iterations, and I'm looking at the frequency of each of these squares. Okay? Of course, you see here more mass now because agents are exploring, right? They're running exploration, and so while the other plays 95 cents, I start to play other actions just to try, and of course it doesn't work. But what's interesting is that the first price auction remains very much symmetric. So these agents are cycling between pairs of bids that are collusive, that are effectively under-competitive, and they're cycling in a very symmetric way. Okay? So something is a little off, yeah. Nothing is.
It's not just each one of us choosing a distribution which is very low. It's really collusion there in the.
That's right. That's right. So there's nothing in the algorithm's specific functions that says you should play symmetric. Of course, the game itself forces you a little bit to be symmetric, because if I bid less than you, I'm going to get 0 payoff, and if I bid like you, I'm going to get half of the payoff, right? So there's a symmetry in payoffs if you want. Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Yeah.
Do they converge to a mixed strategy? There's a cycling.
They're cycling.
So there's no. Sorry, too late. But okay. So they don't. If they converge, you would imagine that they would learn that it's not the best response, and the reason why they don't learn is because there's a cycle.
That's correct. So these are stochastic cycles that are very hard to predict. So I have an entire paper on this that tries to explain these cycles more in detail. But the idea is exactly that if we were playing 10 cents forever, one of us would learn that 10 cents is not optimal, right? Through exploration, even if rare, I would eventually figure out that, yeah, I should bid more, right? So playing against a fixed adversary doesn't work. If you keep your bid at 10 cents, I'm going to eventually outbid you. The same is not true if we're both learning, okay? Yeah. Yes, I'm assuming same learning rates and same exploration rates. You can change these, and it doesn't matter too much. So there's some papers out there doing this type of robustness checks. They're not super important. Makes the results a little bit more messy, but thank you. Okay. So what I want to make the point that this is a different kind of collusion. I want to make the point, as I made at the beginning, that artificial intelligence is in some way really changing the market. Okay, so these algorithms are not colluding explicitly in the sense of sitting down in a smoky room and discussing prices, right? That's also illegal. Sherman Act protects us against that, right? But this is clearly not what's happening. These algorithms are not communicating with each other, right? They're not in any way influencing each other's perceptions other than through the payoffs. Okay, so this is purely repeated interactions. Of course, in repeated interactions, we know we could still have collusion, right? We can have repeated games. Incentives, pretty much. We can have something like tit for tat. But here, these algorithms are not learning what we call tacit collusion traditionally. Right? Because to have tacit collusion, you need to be able to condition your actions on what happened in the past in a very direct fashion. Right? You need to be able to implement something like reward and punishment schemes. You increased your bid today, well, I'm going to increase my bid tomorrow as well, and then we can revert back to collusion after. Right? This can't be what's happening here. Right? Because I'm taking away the ability of the algorithms to condition on past experience other than through this very coarse formulation of the history, which is the Q function. Okay? So I want to argue that this is a new incentive that I call spontaneous coupling that is sustaining dominated outcomes. And spontaneous coupling, as I show in a separate paper, really relies on the fact that these algorithms are less than rational. right? That even though these algorithms are very good at solving Markov decision problems, when they're put against each other, they sort of lack enough strategic thinking, right? They lack thinking about counterfactuals, for example, and this leads to this kind of stochastic cycling. Okay. This is the bid patterns that we see in the first price auction. You see how these agents are playing the same action most of the time. Then one of them eventually figures out, oh, I shouldn't be bidding 10 cents. I should be bidding a little bit more, right? If I bid more, I do better. When that happens, there's an intense phase of what looks like punishments, right? It looks like the average bid up there is 55 cents or so, right? That's clearly worse for both of us, right? Now, this is not an explicit punishment phase. It's not that the algorithms know they're in a punishment phase, but they're exploring. They're trying to figure out, okay, what actions should we play now that we broke out of the 10-cent cycle? And somehow they re-coordinate on a low bid, like 20 cents. Okay? This 20 cents bid go on for a bit, and then again, they re-coordinate on 30 cents after a period of defection. Yeah.
So it seems I don't understand sort of intuitively why there isn't always this pressure to go up. So to drop down, surely they both simultaneously have to explore a lower action and then agree that that's actually better off for the two of them.
Sure.
So that presumably depends on the probability, well, essentially on epsilon, how often these drops occur, right? And you're looking for correlated events that occasionally drive you to do things that are
Very good. So the story is a little bit more complicated than that, in the sense that it's not so much the exploration that has to be symmetric, but it's the fact that my memory of the past is very sticky. Okay? Like I'm thinking, well, 10 cents was pretty good, right? It's close to 90, it's close to 45, right? My value for 10 cents is 45 cents because I'm winning half the time, my payoff is 1, right? Now I break out of that cycle, right? We're exploring some other stuff, but that value of 10 cents is sticky, still at 45, near 45, right? And so, of course, even if we start playing 90 cents, the value of 90 cents is pretty bad. It's 5 cents, right? So eventually I'm going to think, well, why don't I try again? Why don't I try again 10 cents? That has still a
I see.
pretty
So
high
it's the
value.
alpha parameter that affects the memory
That's
that's
right.
perhaps even more critical than the epsilon.
Exactly. So, for example, if alpha is
yeah.
equal to 1,
Yeah.
right? If there's no persistence of actions, this can't happen.
Yeah.
Right? This really has to do with strong persistence of actions that I'm not playing today.
Yeah.
Right? Because I can't understand counterfactuals. Yeah. Thank you. So this is roughly the intuition for what the mechanism is doing and why this mechanism is happening in the first price but not in the second price auction, right? What is different about these two formats? Well, imagine being in a collusion period between Alice and Bob, being at 10 cents, let's say. At some point, one of them explores, figures out, okay, I shouldn't be playing 10. I can play more and win and make more payoff, right? This is profitable both in the first price and in the second price. Of course, the loser, once Alice deviates, Bob now is losing, and so he has an incentive to increase his own bid, right? The difference here is that in the first price auction, the loser doesn't only have an incentive to increase, but also the winner, Alice, has an incentive to decrease her bid. Because if I'm overbidding, I'm making payoff, but I could win paying a little less, right? This incentive pushes down the bids that are selected in the first price auction much more than the bids that are selected in the second price auction. Second price auction has a dominant strategy. I should always be bidding exactly 1. Okay, there's no reason for me to bid any less because the price doesn't depend on my own bid, only the probability of winning. All right. So far I've done what I call positive economics, right? I'm trying to figure out what happens in these two formats, whether we can understand it better. But really, I'm interested in auction design. I'm interested in restoring competition in the first price auction by tinkering with the auction format. Okay. Of course, I can always move from a first price to a second price. That's one solution to this problem. That's already an auction design implication. But I want to give you another implication here. Google switched from second price to first price in 2019 for some of its business, in 2021 for most of the rest of the business. So Google search still using second price auction. Everything else is pretty much on a first price basis now. Okay? At the same time in which they switched, they started providing some more information to their bidders. Okay? Everyone who bids on an auction at Google learns that they lost or they won, but also learns what they call minimum bid to win. This is a screenshot from the Ad Manager API. So what is minimum bid to win telling me? Well, if I lost in the before world, I only knew I lost, nothing else for me to know. So I lost paying 50 cents. I don't know if bidding 60 cents would have been good for me. I don't know if bidding 80 cents would have been good for me, right? Instead, with minimum bid to win, I can compute my full spectrum of counterfactuals. I know exactly what would have happened had I played some other bid, had I chosen some other bid, right? This is surely enough to eliminate completely the need for exploration. I don't need to try different actions to figure out what the value is, because now I can compute it, right? In particular, then, I can rewrite the algorithm to take this information into account, to update every perception in every period, right? Now, the explanation I gave you earlier about the persistence of actions that I'm not playing is completely gone here. Because now, even if I don't play a particular bid, if I don't bid 50 cents every period, I know what I would have gotten had I played 50 cents. And we can show that when you add this information in the first price auction, we restore the competitive equilibrium, the 90 cents competitive equilibrium. Right? In particular, if you look at the prices here, the bids, right? There are long periods of 90 cents. Sometimes someone deviates, right? They figure out by simultaneously exploring that we could be playing 10 cents each and be better off, but those are very short-lived periods, and most of the time we play 90 cents. Thank you. Great timing, I think. Great timing to move on to the second paper. Okay. The second paper is with Aragnac and Andres. Andres was a student in Universidad de Chile. It's called Ads and Conversations. And the question here is, how do we run advertising auctions on large language model chatbots, on ChatGPT, right? People are switching out of Google, and Google makes most of its money on this auctions. So this was a pretty important question when I spent some time there. All right. So most of these chatbots are starting to think about ads. Okay? In particular, there's one, Perplexity, that has directly implemented ads in their conversations. When you ask questions to Perplexity, you'll see some banners on the side, you'll see some ads in between, right? They even say, we consider this because subscriptions are not enough. Okay? We really need advertising to make the business viable. This is an expensive business to run, right? The servers are expensive, the models are expensive. So just for a quick briefing of what search advertising looks like today, for each query, every time you search on Google, there's an auction in the background. Right? Before your results show up, there's an auction being run between multiple bidders. Right? Advertisers will pay only if they get to show the ad and that ad gets clicked. Right? This is a way to measure relevance. Right? At Google, they're trying to match the ad to the person. They want to make sure that the person cares enough about that ad. So they only pay if that ad gets clicked. The winner then is going to be the bidder that has the largest expected bid, where the expectation is just the product of the bid and what we think is the probability that the user will click on that ad. Okay? In particular, in this world, when the query arrives, we run the auction, we show the ad, we collect the money if anybody clicks, and we're done. Okay, so we consider this a one-shot interaction, right? The next time that the user comes, it's going to be a new auction. This is what you see when you search something like shoes on Google, right? Somehow Google must think that I care about sneakers because there's no dress shoes in here, right? They have some priors. They put a bunch of ads on top. Right? These are not advertising. These are sponsored. That's where the auction comes in. Okay. If I click on one of these, Lululemon pays, I don't know, $1 or something like that. Okay. What's different about conversational AIs or LLMs? Well, when you talk to an LLM, you're not just asking one question. I can go to the LLM and say, I would like shoes. But the LLM is not necessarily going to give me shoes to look at. It's going to ask me more questions to figure out what kind of shoes I want. Right? So here's an example. Saying to Gemini, hey, I need shoes. It's like, very happy to see me. Hello there. I'm your personal shopping assistant. Okay, what kind of shoes would you like? What kind of activities do you do with the shoes? Right? It's trying to figure out, do I need wedding shoes or do I need running shoes or what? It's like, hey, let's say running shoes. So they were right. Show me those. Okay, so that's great. What type of runner are you? What terrain do you run on? What is your food type? What is your budget? Right? All these questions to really narrow down on what it is that I'm looking for to give me the best possible recommendation. Right? Say, I mostly run trails. I have some overpronation. I want to avoid what kind of runner I am. I'm not going to disclose that. It's like, what is your running experience? It's really trying to figure out, am I a good runner or a bad runner? It's like, intermediate. Okay, so if you have these characteristics, right? Intermediate trail runner, good stability shoe, fine. Then how about Salomon Speed Cross 6? It's a very specific type of shoe, okay? It knows exactly what I'm looking for, and it's telling me this is it. There's not much to choose from, okay? These are the two shoes that you might care about, and we're done, okay? But this is markedly different because at each point in the conversation, the large language model is narrowing down on what I care about, right? It's a funnel, right? From many candidates that could be interesting to me, the conversation is shrinking to 1, 2, 3 things, okay? It asks questions until I end up giving him the answer. This is very different from Google search also because click-through rates, right? The probability that the user clicks on a particular ad at any point in the conversation is going to get more and more precise. The further down I go, the more likely it is that you care about those Salomon Speed Cross and you're going to click on them, okay? I mean, the limit, in fact, let me assume the assistant gets a perfect match. It knows the one thing that I care about, okay? So then before we were treating ad qualities as static, right? It's a number, it's a probability today. Now we need to think about these ad qualities as dynamic. We're learning about these ad qualities throughout the conversation. If I learn about this ad quality, there's a bunch of questions that come up, right? Because I need to figure out, for example, when do I want to run this auction? Do I want to get very precise estimates, or do I want to hold off on the precision and just run the auction early, all right? So my model is a model of online advertising and conversational AI, where the auctioneer learns the ad quality over the conversation, okay? The user is going to only be shown one ad. You can generalize this a little bit. Let's say you get shown 2 or 3, whatever, right? And the auctioneer commits to the auction format, but doesn't commit to the time of the auction format. You can think of an auctioneer that says, look, I'm going to run a first price auction. Let me decide when to run it based on your answers, okay? And then the auctioneer is choosing both format and timing. The format is chosen beforehand. The timing is chosen upon receiving bids, let's say, okay? So more formally, this is a paper that studies equilibria of repeated auction, of dynamic auctions with limited commitment, where the auctioneer is choosing a precision, the level of precision that it wants to run the auction at, after observing every advertiser's bid, okay? And the advertisers, of course, will anticipate this decision and therefore bid accordingly, all right? So when should the auctioneer run this auction, and does the auction format matter? Yeah.
Sorry, just to understand, you get the information and you get bids at each stage. Sorry. So you get bids at each stage as you get narrower and narrower?
Very good. You get one bid, right? Because the bid is given at the beginning, before the user starts, let's say. The user comes on, says shoes, I'm going to collect a bunch of bids. And then I can decide, do I wait until I figure out if he's a trail runner or not to run this auction with these bids, right? What changes is the match part. The match part is the probability that the user clicks on a particular ad, right?
But why wouldn't Google just get the most amount of information possible? I'm missing the incentive to finish early.
There's a few, very good. So I'll get to that in a second. Is there another question?
Basically, the winner of the auction in this case is not the guy who offered the best price. It's the guy who offered the best price plus the guy who offered the best match. And maybe you had a good match with the word at the beginning, but after I found, well, it kind of went down. No, that's
exactly.
the issue.
Exactly. So it's a best price times best match.
Okay, it's in, okay.
Yeah, that's broad. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So you're right. It sounds like, why don't I just always run the auction at the end, right? I get more information. I know exactly who is there, who is going to get clicked. I get money for sure, right? And that's true. I mean, if I run the auction late, right, I know that the ad is going to get clicked. High quality ad definitely wins. There's no misallocation at all. But there's an issue, which is that competition is going to be very weak at the end, right? I had all these shoes to pull from. I had all these guys like Wedding Shoes and whatever other guy that was interested in advertising, and now those guys are gone. Right? They provide no pricing power at this point in the conversation, right? Now there's one guy. In fact, if there's one guy, the price should be 0, right? The externality for that guy in a second price auction is 0, right? On the other hand, if I run the auction early, there's going to be definitely misallocation. I'm going to choose someone that may not be optimal, may not be clicked, so I give up on revenue, right? At the same time, the competition is pretty fierce. There's a ton of ads, right? So it's likely that my pricing power is very strong at this point in the conversation. Make sense? Great. So when should we show this ad? Well, as it turns out, it depends a lot on this format. Okay? A second price auction really relies on the competition between the bidders to choose prices. Okay? So if you assume that you're running a second price auction, competition decreases really fast as you wait. As you hold off, competition is going down. And so the auctioneer always has an incentive to stop early. In fact, if you're running a second price auction, there's only 2 bidders, your incentive is to stop immediately, to not learn anything at all about the quality of the advertisers. Okay? Instead, the first price auction relies on the expectations of competition at the end, right? The bids are taking into account in their expectations how many competitors there's going to be at any point in time, right? But once I get the bids as an auctioneer, I now have no incentive to stop immediately, right? Because now you're going to pay your own bid regardless. So I just want to make sure that you're the right advertiser at that point, right? So first price auction definitely gets us efficient allocations. Okay? And first price auction always runs at the very end of the conversation, or at least towards the very end of the conversation. Okay? Now this says something about timing, doesn't say anything about revenue yet, right? Because revenue depends both on when I stop and on the equilibrium implications of when I stop. For a second price auction, it doesn't really matter because the second price auction is truthful regardless of when I stop. Awesome. I think I'm going to finish early. The second price auction is truthful regardless of when I stop. In particular, it's truthful at time 0, it's truthful at time infinity, right? So second price auction is no problem. It's easy to compute revenue. For the first price auction, it's tricky because now bidders anticipate that the auctioneer is going to wait a long time. They anticipate that they might be the only person bidding in that auction at time infinity. And if that's the case, well, their bid should be really small, right? They shouldn't be overpaying for an impression where nobody else cares, okay? So it turns out that without reserve prices, the second price auction revenue strictly dominates the first price. And in fact, we can show that the first price auction revenue can be arbitrarily worse than the second price auction. What I mean is that the ratio between the two can be as close to infinity as possible. What's interesting is that if you add reserve prices, this relationship completely flips. Now the first price auction implements the optimal auction in the cycle. Okay? So I can extract optimal revenue by running a first price auction with a reserve price that stops at infinity. Okay? Instead, the second price auction still doesn't implement the optimal auction. Why? Because that incentive to stop early is still there. Imagine you have 2 bidders, both submitting really high bids, and the optimal reserve price, which is somewhat lower, less than half of the highest bid, right? Then I still would rather stop immediately and take the money with some probability rather than wait and potentially take only the reserve price, okay? So the second price auction is worse than the first price auction, strictly worse again in this instance. Awesome. That's pretty much what I have. So open to questions. All good? Yeah.
So it must be related at some point to the basic trade-off between market thickness and efficiency. I'm a bit curious about the details of the model, just to be. So how do you model this learning and the queue? And I guess for Google, this would have been an issue earlier if they had better information about bidders. It was just not a problem because now I understand that because just they were not precise enough, so they never had incentives to blur it up themselves before. Is that correct?
That's right. So it's much trickier on Google search to track you across sessions, right? Like you're searching for shoes today, then you come back tomorrow, then you go back to the first query. It's a little harder, right? On this, it's very obvious, right? That you're just doing this all in one place. With respect to the model part, I can tell you a little bit more about it.
We can talk offline, but
yeah.
Do you know if it's sort of at a high level? Is there anything intrinsic about the AI or this is something that happened in wheat markets, in oil markets, that they create standards so that
Very good, very good. So,
So-
so you're perfectly right. In fact, I think this trade-off is there in many other markets. It's very sensible here because there is this pricing per click, right? That's the key. Because if the bids are just, if there's no sort of expected quality aspect to it, then this model has nothing to say, right? You always want to go to the end. You always want to learn the best. That's okay. Here, the fact that your price depends on how many people are there, which has to do with the click-through rates, right? The fact that match is getting better or worse, that's what really plays a role here. But this is true in other markets. Say like, in private equity, you're doing due diligence, right? Would you rather collect bids before or after the due diligence? This is kind of the same intuition, I want to say.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Awesome, thank you. Thank you very much.
I will let you know. The face of Sí, yes. Okay, so now we have Benjamin Manning from MIT. 45 minutes.
All right, hey everyone. My name's Ben. I'm a PhD student at MIT. I'm primarily an economist, although as you'll see from this, I heavily dabble in computer science. And today I'm going to show you some work thinking about, AI agents, a little bit of an amorphous term, and social scientific discovery. So this is going to be a different kind of, blend between positivist and maybe not so positivist economics, and is a very different flavor than Martino. All right, so this presentation is also it's a combination of 3 papers. Feel free to go look any of them up. One of them is not yet posted, but hopefully will be soon. And yeah, just thinking about AI agents and scientific discovery. So starting off, this is going to be the background for the talk today. Starting off, here is a very stylized version of the social scientific process. If you're an empirical economist, you probably do something that is akin to this cycle with your work. You have a hypothesis, you run an experiment to test that hypothesis, you analyze the results, you update your model of the world, and you continue ad infinitum until you get tenure, retire, or other bad things happen. And AI has started to kind of proliferate in this entire process. For example, with hypothesis generation, there's been a bunch of really interesting new papers exploring how we can incorporate AI into hypothesis generation. Sendhil Mullainathan, he's a professor at MIT, has been kind of the leader of a lot of this work, thinking about basically how we can, explain unexplained predictive power in models from social scientific phenomenon. And there's been other work kind of thinking about how we can generate hypotheses from large language models, which is pretty easy to do. You could generate a really simple hypothesis going up to ChatGPT and be like, what are some methods that I could be a better presenter, for example? Any social science phenomenon. You open up ChatGPT and it will give you some sort of hypothesis. Maybe more exciting has been a recent development in that AI might be able to assist a little bit more with the experimental part of the social scientific process. In particular, asking AI to be a facsimile of a human subject. The very simple idea behind this would be to prompt ChatGPT. Here's a prompt I put into ChatGPT this morning. This is myself. My girlfriend does not love this slide. But if you open up ChatGPT, and you guys can all do this afterward with maybe some more honest caricatures, and you ask it to answer this question with some specific, maybe slightly idiosyncratic details, what you'll find is it not only gives an answer, but it gives an answer that is quite reasonable given what you put in. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, PhD-y style answer. However, if you prompt it with some other attributes, here's my advisor, John. He's a faculty member. And then you ask it the same question. The answer it gives is more what you might expect from a faculty member. I'm not saying it's perfect, but this idea that you can basically endow an LLM with traits or features, and it will respond to questions in ways that at least seemingly provide reasonable facsimiles of humans. And this is kind of like a blowing up research agenda, is can we use these agents in social science research? I'm going to dive into it a little bit more. The answer is, unsurprisingly, rather equivocal. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We're still figuring it out. It depends. But I'm going to dive into it a little bit and show you a more specific example. So the main idea behind this is thinking about this paper, which is Large Language Models as Simulated Economic Agents. And this paper kind of contrasts the idea of a social LLM subject towards kind of classical economic theorizing. So what do we do as economists? I'm just presuming many of you in this room are economists, is a large part of the research agenda is to take Homo economicus, which is this maintained stylized model of human behavior, such that we perfectly understand the assumptions it makes. A lot of our work then, puts it through different situations, and then the follow-up work from that is to often see how Homo sapiens compares. Now, this idea of using an LLM, you can think of it as a Homo silicus. So instead of having this maintained model of human behavior that always acts rationally and makes perfect prediction about the world and has unlimited memory, we have a model that predicts what's most likely based on the training corpus and the RLHF process that it goes through by whatever a big tech company or whoever decides to build it. And then we can do the same thing, put it through many different, experiments that we might put a human subject through, or that we might put Homo economicus through, and we can make comparisons and look afterward. So here's a simple fairness experiment from a famous paper by Richard Thaler, Danny Kahneman, and Jack Netsch, where they ask about price gouging. So here's the paper that they ask a bunch of Canadians on the phone. A hardware store has been selling snow shovels for $15. The morning after a large snowstorm, the store raises the price to $20. Rate this action as completely fair, acceptable, unfair, or very unfair. I did give this presentation in a place once where there was no snow and they couldn't relate to it. So hopefully you guys have a little bit more concept for what this would mean. If they raise it, this is called price gouging. I'm sure many of you know more about price gouging than myself. It's illegal in many countries, probably illegal in Chile, if I had to guess, in many environments. And 82% of the respondents, they had about 100, said that it was at least unfair in responding to this. So now what we're going to do is we're going to ask this same question to a bunch of AI agents and see how they respond. Here, just to kind of give you an idea of how easy this is, and I'm going to do a cardinal sin and show you a slide that is difficult to read, is all the Python code, like 25 lines, that needed to run the entire experiment that I'm going to show you. So, the first thing that's exciting about these experiments is they're easy to run. What we're going to do is provide an LLM with the exact same text from the original experiment. However, we're going to do some additional variations. We're going to do some other prices besides $20. We're going to do 16, 40, and 100. And we're also going to vary some of its political opinions to see if there's correlations between how we might expect it to respond and how it does, similar to my example with myself and my advisor. All right, so here I'm going to show you the results. Each of the columns is a different, amount of price gouging from 16, 20, 40, and 100, all starting at 15. Each of the rows is a different political orientation, broadly going from very fiscally right on the bottom to fiscally left on the top, without super quibbling over the exact specifications of that, scale. The x-axis is the different fairness judgments. And what we did was I asked each agent from those different combinations that I showed you on the previous slide, the question 100 times each with the temperature set to 1. For those of you unfamiliar with temperature, it's a parameter that changes the stochasticity of the response. So instead of giving the highest probability of response every time, I'm receiving a distribution. Yes, if you query the API. Yeah.
If you want to replicate the results, would you choose the minimum? So it is possible to replicate these results by setting this to the minimum, or still with the minimum is not the,
So
there is some randomness?
technically, setting the temperature to 0 should always respond with the modal response from the distribution as predicted by the LLM using the tokens that were provided in the prompt. if you do that in practice, who knows if these tech companies are implementing that correctly? I wouldn't like bet my money on it. If you raise the temperature high enough and you query enough times, though, if you like temperature 1, for example, you get some pretty good large sample approximations. Like it's going to asymptote to a reasonable distribution. So I would say that if you put this exact prompt in 100 times like I did into GPT-4, I believe I used for this model, you're going to get a pretty similar distribution. I would be willing to bet a fair amount of money that it will look very similar. That makes the y-axis the different proportion of respondents. So let's look at some of the results. If we look at the libertarian, that's Ayn Rand. She is a very famous libertarian in America who wrote some maybe controversial books would be one way to describe it. The conservative libertarian is always pretty okay with any sort of price gouging. Now, if we move to our more liberal friends, that's a very liberal politician in America. I forgot to change these before, I apologize. We see that they are generally far less accepting of any sort of price gouging. And as you increase the price gouging, they become less and less tolerant. So they, as the, under a $1 price gouge, none of them are okay with it, but some qualify as unfair versus very unfair. And as you shift from going smaller amounts to larger amounts, we get this unequivocal, not okay. And unsurprisingly, when we fill in the rest, it kind of, there's this naturally increasing acceptance as we go down from political left to political right across the entire spectrum. So going down, we're getting more acceptable. And as we go for more amounts of money, it's universally less acceptable. The libertarian doesn't really change. It's the same. But even the conservative, actually, this is hard to see. There's a little bit of density that is kind of going into the unfair realms on the $100 price gouge. Just stepping back for a moment, this is kind of what you would expect if I were to ask you this before, right? I think most people would expect something that looks a little bit like this. So a question we might now ask is, did the LLMs replicate the Kahneman et al. Findings? And I have now done this, but my advisor has also done this a lot, is if you ask this question to a bunch of people, you will get pretty variable answers. And I would say for this research question, the answer is that people do have moral views on price changings, and they tend to change in reasonably predictive ways. And if we were to go compare this to the human subjects that originally did this experiment, the only thing the paper says is they've called people in Vancouver and Toronto. There's no other information about the sample. I don't have any other demographic information. I emailed the professor who did it. Well, he didn't respond to me, but there was no other. But, the left-leaning respondents, which from a major Canadian city is probably more left-leaning, if I were to guess, are generally viewing the $5 price gouge as very unfair. So it is kind of aligned. This was a fun tweet from the original poster of the paper. Richard Thaler, who I'm sure many of you know, he was a Nobel Prize winner, saw that we did this experiment and then responded by saying that what they originally had to do was fax questions to people to get this responses, and it took them weeks. And we did this, I think it took my computer about 25 seconds. So that's just kind of a way to contextualize these experiments. So they're kind of giving us these reasonable responses. And there's been a bunch of papers that have started to explore this, including, I'm going to skip that slide for time, this one very exciting paper that ran about 100 of these experiments, and they front ran the real human subjects experiments such that they were not in the LLM's training corpus. And the estimated treatment effect sizes were correlated at like 0.85 between the LLM subjects and the real human subjects, with guaranteed linkage between them. So there's clearly something going on here such that the LLM can predict human subjects experiments in some context. Now, this was about like political persuasion in social media. It did a great job at predicting those people's responses. I'm guessing if you were to, try and do people's responses in like Bangladeshi flood zones where there's much less support in the data for those kinds of subjects, you would get much less reliable answers. So it kind of correlates with, what you might think might be embedded in text on the internet. So I'm going to move, yes.
Like 10 times. I would guess also that you can sort of predict when they're going to do well and when the experiment is sort of difficult to predict, right? Because in this case, I imagine that you thought that the LLM was going to predict this, and you said, and then I don't know how to formalize it, but there must be some questions where you think the LLM is much less likely. As you said, maybe just going to questions about Bangladesh. I don't know.
Yeah, I was saying,
And
yeah, okay,
So
continue.
can you think of ways of formalizing or thinking about when it would correlate and when it not, ex ante, like without having to trust so much the gut feeling, let's say?
So that is I mean, that is like a little bit of an open research question. And I think what we're trying to do, some of the work I have now ongoing, is beginning to try running these at scale. So right now, most of the papers in this area, which there are now hundreds, like everyone and their brother is like, I can play with LLMs, including me. That is what a lot of this work is doing like 4 to 5 experiments. And so I think what we're going to try and do to answer that question, which is a question of, I would say it's like many questions of external validity, is one of the projects I'm working on is basically create a system that takes in a paper and then automatically runs the experiment on LLMs for you so that we could run this at scale across thousands of papers. And I think that will be kind of the future. Like right now, we do not have a good, I cannot give you ex ante guarantees, but we're going to figure it out. And then if we have, let's say I could replicate all of experimental economics with this. I could then begin to tell you the areas where it was going to be more reliable or less reliable. And I could give you a probability distribution. I'd be like, your experiment is, similar in token space to this type of experiment that economists have previously run, which replicates en silica according to your outcome variable with 87.3% of the time. So I think that's kind of the future we're going to start trying to go for with this. But right now, I would not see this as like the humans are going to do what the LLM did. And I can't give you the boundary conditions yet. Cool. All right, so there's a bunch of other work, as I've mentioned, kind of just exploring how these subjects behave. And I'm just gonna ask that you bear with me and say that this idea is interesting and it can work sometimes. Because the rest of the presentation, I'm gonna think about how we can extend the idea with these agents to kind of do things that would otherwise not be possible with human subjects. So caveat in mind, let's suspend our disbelief and assume that these AI agents can be good. And as we showed from this paper, they can be good, although they often fail a lot as well. So returning to our stylized model of the social scientific process, we showed that AI can do hypothesis generation. I've hopefully convinced you that it can be an interesting surrogate for human subjects. And the final process, analyzing results, is actually extremely easy. Any sort of pre-registered experiment, if you were just comparing 2 treatment groups or whatever you want to do ahead of time, is easy to ex ante automate, because oftentimes like a pre-registration or the experiment itself implies some sort of analysis. It doesn't apply every kind of robustness check you've ever wanted to do, but if I wanted to compare the height of the people on this side of the room versus the height on the people of this side of the room, there's like a natural implied statistical test that would compare those different groups. I don't really need AI. So what we noticed in one of the 3 papers I showed you before, the titles, the automated social science paper, is that AI can be a non-trivial automator and contributor to each of these different portions of the social scientific process. And so we wanted to see how far can we push, can we combine these things into kind of a full iterated loop of social scientific exploration. And so that's what we did. We made a computational system that basically asks an LLM to generate hypotheses. It then designs experiments to test its own hypotheses. It can then instantiate instances of those LLM agents that I just talked to you extensively about, run the experiment that it has designed, and then automatically analyze the results based on the experiment that it quote unquote pre-registered when it was designing it. And the big idea here is basically there's all these little steps along the way in designing an experiment and doing anything for that matter. And kind of before generative AI came out, in order to automate anything, if you wanted to write a computer program, you had to very explicitly basically provide every if-else conditional logic you might want to do. If you want to code anything, if I want to code an implementation of OLS, I need to, specify the exact matrix inversion I'm going to do and all the little steps. Or if I don't want to do a matrix inversion, want to do some, Newton's method gradient descent, I would have to do every single for loop by hand. But now what I can do is I can just tell the LLM, hey, go implement OLS for me. And 99% of the time, if you've used the largest frontier models like GPT, ChatGPT o1, or Claude Sonnet 3.7, this is a trivial task. But it could do it in like 50 different ways. I mean, it could just change all of the variable names. There's all these little details it can take care of. And so now what we can do with these LLMs is abstract up a level of the things we are trying to instruct it to do and identify higher level processes, and it can then fill in the details. So I have provided one kind of, set of instructions to do quote unquote science, and the LLM can fill in the details that I did not specify, which allows us to do automation in these more interesting higher level abstractions. So I'm going to walk you through the system exactly what we did. Here's the brief overview of the paper. So the first thing we do is this system.
Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah.
A little question. I have worked with AI agents, and one of the biggest challenges I've had is when I use a ton of agents, it follows this stochastic process. So it is difficult to rail all the way to the answer that I want there. So for example, it could generate a good hypothesis. I have an agent that's working on that. But then the second agent that designs the experiment could misinterpret that. And it goes like through a way that I don't want. Did you have this problem, and have you sorted it out in any way?
Yeah, we did have this problem, and it required us to. So I'll say two things. With the newest, we did this with GPT-4. We're working on revising this paper. It is going to be much easier for us to do now with O1, which will do what you're saying more reliably. But we basically had to have produce response, 5 LLMs check response, all like a continuous validation on every single iteration. And we had to do extensive prompting to like really finagle it to make sure it was providing responses in ways that we wanted it to. The repo is public. I can show you the code afterward. You can see that I have about, I think, 10,000 words of prompts. And it is a proof of concept, and it fails probably 30% of the time. But it works 70, and that was it. We basically got it to work 70, and then we stopped and wrote the paper. So it would surely be much better at this point, and will be. And I'll show you the process we used. I think our modularization, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to modularize the process such that this would be less of an issue. The way the system works is it can take in any system, any social scientific area you think is interesting. So just on your keyboard, you type in, maybe you're interested in 2 people bargaining over a mug, a job interview, whatever your empirical realm is that you think is cool. And then what it does is it takes in this empirical realm and it generates a hypothesis as a form of a DAG, which is more computer science causal inference, kind of popularized by Judea Pearl. And I know that a lot of the top economists hate this stuff with a passion. However, it lends itself really nicely to having a complex model of many interrelated causes and outcomes, and you can immediately identify the effects on the pathways. And if you have a structural causal model, it also naturally implies an experiment to test the model. If I have a cause and I have an effect and I have an arrow going from the cause to the effect, what do I need to do to test the effect? I need to induce exogenous variation in the cause. So this DAG basically buys us the whole thing. It provides a data structure for the hypotheses. All hypotheses are specified as causes and outcomes. It gives us a blueprint for designing the agents. So if I have a hypothesis that I think raising the buyer's reservation price in a negotiation will affect whether or not a deal occurs. I then want to instantiate AI agents that vary on the buyer's reservation price if I'm going to run simulations, and that will directly test the hypothesis. And this hypothesis also naturally implies a very simple estimation problem, which is to regress the cause on the effect. So I'm going to walk you through it. 2 people bargaining over a mug. You can imagine just asking an LLM to answer this. It's really easy. What is an outcome we might care about? Whether or not a deal occurs. And just to give you a really clear point on this. It is the system basically coring itself with the questions we've pre-written that we have ordained as important parts of the scientific process. And if you were to ask ChatGPT this, what is a plausible outcome if I was an economist that I might care about to run this experiment, it easily answers this question. We have lots of very easy questions to answer. So it can identify that a deal occurs. Next, you might ask it what are outcomes it might, oh yes. Oh, okay, stretching. If you do the same question, you can pipe in, hey, you thought that whether or not a deal occurs would be an interesting outcome variable to test for two people bargaining over a mug. Please give me 2 causes that you might think be interesting. 3 causes, 4 causes, 500 causes. Easy answer.
So previously you had multiple target variables?
This was just like and when we run it, we're like, give us 1.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
this was me just showing you that, look, this is so easy, it can easily produce these answers.
Oh, I see. I was
Yeah.
worried about combinatorial explosion of DAGs. Are you going to actually pursue multiple hypotheses, or you just have one and you're trying to validate it?
I'm going to show you one right now, but the future would hopefully be to run thousands of these.
I see. Got it.
If we can get this right on small levels, you can start to imagine how you could scale it. If that didn't make sense to anyone, we'll get there. So yes, this was an example, but in the simulation I'm running, I was like, give me 1 outcome that you might think is interesting. Now give me some causes that you might think are interesting. Very simple. Now, how would you operationalize or measure these variables? Also easy to ask. We might, money, sentimental attachment, it could be a categorical Likert scale. Whether or not deal occurs is binary. And then finally, how do we induce variation in these causes? The model can also come up with, I'm going to vary the amount of money, and here are the dollar amounts I'm going to vary, my different treatment effects. So the treatments, quote unquote, here are varying the buyer's budget, these different amounts, varying the seller's sentimental attachment in natural language, how much they, quote unquote, care about the mug, and we'll just do the full convex combination of those, run, I guess that would be 16 simulations, although you ramp it up a lot more. So the next thing we do is we take those hypotheses and we construct the relevant agents that would run the experiment implied by the hypothesis. So what we do is we have a buyer and a seller. It can figure out how many numbers of agents they are. It tolerates any number of agents. There are some simulations where we have 4 agents. And we just decided to give them goals and potential constraints to be a little more economicsy, but that's like a flexible decision. And we want to make them be a little more rational. And then what we do is we have these parameters that are variables as a function of the experiment. So each instantiation of this agent, similar to when I showed you the price gouging example, is going to have a different one of these values in the simulations. So we're going to have a simulation where the buyer values it at 40 and the seller is extremely attached. We're going to have another simulation where the buyer values it 5 and the seller is extremely attached, etc. So after we've constructed these agents, we need to figure out how they're going to interact. This is actually a non-trivial problem. I'm not going to get into it because it's very nitpicky. But if you have 2 agents, you can imagine that there's only one way to order their interactions. It's have them alternating speaking. However, if you had a simulation where there were 3 agents, it's very non-obvious how you determine who speaks next. If you've never thought about this, next time you're in a conversation with more than one person, try and figure out how you are determining who speaks next.
You could try what happens if one of them makes the offer every time. You could also try what happens if the other one makes the offer every time.
So
and you know that the Nash equilibrium is quite different. So it would be.
You could do lots of things for this example, but one of the things we're trying to do with this system is make it generalizable. So bargaining is not important. So we could do this on anything. And so like, imagine that I wanted to run an auction with 20 people, or I wanted to study 2 parents and 2 children having a discussion at dinner. And what are the outcomes of that discussion or something?
But even the very simple scenario of a bargaining with 2 people, sort of small details, at least in theory, maybe the theory is all wrong, not theory, so let's hope that it's not. But even in this very simple scenario, it would be very different if one makes the offers every time, or the other one makes the offer, or you go one-on-one.
Yeah.
And somehow that subtlety will be, I don't know if it really doesn't matter, which it would be sad for my career, but fine. or it will be sort of embedded somehow in a grayscale in the
I think it surely does matter. We could implement it. We could basically implement whatever you want. And we could have the system operating completely autonomously, or we could have you making all the decisions while we're going. You know, maybe you have it come up with the hypotheses, you tweak it, then you like adjust the agents, then it picks how they want it to interact. You're like, I don't like that. That's not evaluating my theory directly. I want to like adjust this output and how it's going to proceed. I think what I'm showing you here is more proof of concept than undeniable.
Let me put as a proof of concept, like the fact that you're forced to thinking about every step when you code, sort of forces you to think of stuff that you might not have thought otherwise. And one risk of this is that there's stuff that you will never think about because it's automated, but you might be missing stuff because you never had to go through the process of thinking about, for example, which is the...
That's a fair critique.
So
I guess
something to think about. I understand maybe it's unfair. I understand.
No. I think that's really reasonable. And I also think that a natural response to this presentation is like trying to automate away social science. It's become very clear to me that will not be successful within the next like 10 years. I think that this will only be successful as complement. And I say that because the LLMs seem to be at this point, like the best machine learning models at this point seem to be, as far as I can tell, unable to perform well super out of distribution. Like it's inconceivable to me that an LLM comes up with special relativity. Like our greatest theories, our greatest jumps in kind of thinking, like I don't understand how an AI is going to be able to do those out of sample jumps, and we haven't seemed to make much progress on it. So yeah, I think it's like a really valid thing to say. Continuing on, in the paper, we basically come up with a few different ways to handle this. One of the ways is we have an extra agent that is not participating in the discussion and picks who goes next. It's like an extra LLM that we call the coordinator. Kind of an open problem that I think computer scientists are going to have to agonize over a lot is how do you coordinate lots of agents talking to each other when humans just do it? Maybe like a Markov model of some sorts, I'm not sure. But once we instantiate these agents, they construct all of these different dialogues. So each one for a different exogenous variation that we ran in the experiment. Here's kind of a dialogue when the buyer's budget's $10. Here's one from the buyer's budget's $40. We get these really rich textual dialogues under each variation. And the system is launching these all at once. And each of them is a different X variable. So I think in the case of the paper, we ran this simulation with 2 people bargaining over the mug, and the sample size was like 400 pairs of simulations. It gets quite large. Now, collecting the data is actually very easy. We have these rich natural language transcripts. And for this example, we just have an outcome variable of whether or not a deal occurred. And I've shown you all the things an LLM can do. Some of you have probably Googled far more impressive things that they can do, but you can just give them the transcript and be like, was the Y variable no deal or deal, or whatever the outcome is that you're interested in. It's very easy to measure at scale by just going to the tape, as you might say in sports. And finally, we have our X variables, because those are the exogenous variations, the Y variables, which are measured by looking at the tape. You can just estimate a linear model super easily, or whatever model you wanted. You have your covariates, and maybe you want to try a different causal model that you think is implying something else. Judea Pearl has taken care of identification for pretty much any causal model you can imagine. So that's the overarching idea. And now I'm going to share you some results. The input is 2 people bargaining over a mug. I didn't do anything else besides put in this sentence, which isn't even a full, well, actually, maybe it is a full sentence. So it decided that the buyer and the seller were the relevant agents, and it proposed this DAG as a hypothesis about what could be important in this simulation or this, social scientific endeavor. It chooses whether or not a deal occurs and the buyer's budget, the seller's budget, and the seller's sentimental attachment, maybe like an endowment effect-esque type variable. Now, it also picks the different levels of variation. It picks 9 possible values to induce variation into the buyer's budget. Similarly, for the seller's minimum acceptable price and the seller's sentimental attachment. This gives us 405 simulations through the full factorial combination of all of them. All right, let's look at the data. Here is a really simple example of these bargaining plots I'm going to show you. The x-axis is the turn number, the number of statements they make. The y-axis is the offer number. The x-axis, blue shows the seller's reservation value and black shows the buyer's reservation value. So we can see that when there's green between them, that's the possible positive return for both. And then matching the colors, black is buyer, blue is seller, green triangle is deal, red X means no deal was reached. Here is a full grid of the subset of the results. So the columns are different reservation values for the buyer, and the rows are different reservation values for the seller. And so each of these is a different negotiation. This is about 1/4 of the negotiations. And what you can see is that across the line, where this diagonal represents when the buyer's valuation is above the seller's valuation, you're getting deals in the green where they should occur. And you're seeing green diamonds in general. And you're also seeing red X's in general when no deal is rationally possible. So it looks pretty reasonable. And they're not having any instructions. We're just telling them, go bargain over this mug. So deals happen where they should. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see. And the realized prices often look Nash bargaining-ish. I'm not going to make a really strong claim about that, but they tend to be splitting the difference. We also see this really interesting phenomenon that is there appears to be gradual convergence. People are making offers and meeting towards the middle over time. And that is something that Nash bargaining explicitly does not predict, but was found in this really cool paper by Backus et al. In the QJE with, I'm forgetting his name, but they look at bargaining over 25 million eBay negotiations, and they find empirical evidence of this meeting in the middle, gradual kind of towards the Nash bargaining behavior that is not predicted by theory. So kind of cool that we're just randomly seeing it with the LLM. Maybe you might say the LLM memorized that response from this one medium-cited paper in all of economics, or I can't preclude that possibility, but it seems unlikely to me. Here's another interesting thing. Here's an irrational deal. The buyer lost, the seller lost money, or the buyer lost money. But when we go to the tape and we read what actually happened, they made a side deal, which is a very, reasonable thing to do. So there's even explanations for when they have bad behavior. I don't have a perfect way to fit this into everything, but it kind of shows that, in my opinion, without getting too prescriptive, that's a very human thing to do. You might disagree, feel free. So, as I said, why does this work? Well, the LLM has a really good model of Nash bargaining, so they're hitting the Nash. However, it also read the Backus paper. It did. I queried GPT-4 to see if it had information on the Backus paper. It does. But this would mean that it translated that information into the 800 agents that I had iteratively interact with each other, and it produced the paper from that behavior. I think it's probably more likely that the training corpus in the LLMs contains an unimaginably large example of people doing economic transactions, and it's portraying a facsimile of them. Okay. Now, looking at the results of this experiment, as we've talked about before, it measured the variables by just looking at all of the transcripts. We find also really reasonable results. When the buyer's budget increases by $1, we get about a 4 percentage point increase in the probability of a deal. When the sellers increases their minimum price by $1, we get a 4-ish percentage points decrease in the probability of a deal. And when we go up in each of these ordinal categories, the more attached the seller is to the mug, the less likely a deal is to occur. Yes. Oh, double yes.
Okay, I really like this work, but I want to ask a challenging question here.
Go for broke.
Okay, do you think this would work for, say, something like cars or homes? And here's where I'm going with this. So have you ever seen somebody negotiate these things? The buyer is oh my God, I love this car. I love this car. And then proceeds to behave super irrationally, right? They overpay for this thing. And if you go on any dealer, like go on any deer lot and watch people behave like this, and they act super irrational. And they're like, great, we got a sucker. We're gonna like overcharge this person, right?
Mhm.
People do this with like kind of like most like economic transactions in the world, right? So like how would this behave when you have this kind of irrationality? Because these agents are like, you value this, great, I'm gonna negotiate, and we see that kind of behavior. But like, do we really see the full spectrum of human insanity within these things?
Surely not.
Right, but these agents are like are LFH into like, you know, being super rational.
So here's what I would say. Yeah, I believe that the future is going to, one thing I'll say, I don't think the foundation models will be the future of this work. I think we're going to have to construct new open models that are RLH def to respond like people. This will not work at scale. However, at the point of building this paper, none of the open model LLMs were good enough to do this. That has kind of changed. And when we post the new version, I can confidently tell you that we will not, that we'll be attempting to use models that are going to be better facsimiles for humans. I would also argue that if you were to take out ChatGPT right now and tell it that it was like a really emotionally attached 21-year-old whose parent had given them the car when it was 16, now bargain with another agent that has been told to be a vicious car dealer that is like from a movie, that you would probably get some behavior that you might expect. So I think that I've given you an incredibly simple stylized example without any additional demographic information. But the context windows of these LLMs is like 1 million tokens now. You could stuff it with everything I've ever said, and then you could have it start negotiating, make it way more realistic. I don't know for sure if it would be perfect, but I bet you that you could create a comically accurate portrayal of the example you just offered.
I mean, I wish I knew my prompt, right?
You wish you knew your what?
My prompt, right? If I knew like all the things that I was talking about, right?
But I do think that you raise good points. I think it's an open empirical question as to when this is going to be good and what types of things it does poorly and not poorly represent. And even that question, like your social scientific sample of interest is, the data you use for your research is a function of your research question. If I'm interested in how do people bargain, I'm going to ask college students. If I want to know that like, how do, you know, angsty teenagers bargain over their car with aggressive car dealers, I'm gonna have to go find a different sample. So I think it's like thinking about when this may or may not be good. All right, I've got limited time, but I'm gonna oh, yes, go.
Just a quick question. I'm assuming you run it multiple times, like on various like questions, like, you know, the mug bargaining and other things. Did you ever get a hypothesis that turns out to be not like no? Where the estimates end up no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I get the feeling that like, you know, our job as social scientists, the hard part is really coming up with the hypothesis.
We chose really simple hypotheses. Sorry. Yes, I can show you after I do not show them here, but we did 4 simulations, bargaining over a mug, an auction, which I'm going to show you, a court argument over a defendant who was trying to get bail with 4 agents, and there was a null path on one of the tests, and then a 4th thing that I'm totally escaping my memory. So right now, we're going to do one more example. Input, 3 bidders participating in an auction for a piece of art starting at $50, and that is what I put in. It, you know, generates 3 agents and an auctioneer as the interesting area of study, and then it identifies the speaking order as auctioneer, bidder 1, auctioneer, bidder 2, auctioneer, bidder 3, in an iterative cycle. Subjective choice that you could argue with, but this is what it did. And it varies the different reservation values of each of the bidders across a bunch of different values. And what we find, unsurprisingly, is that a $1 increase in any of the bidders' reservation values leads to about a 33-cent increase in the probability, a 33-cent increase in the final value of the piece of art. And this is not surprising. This is a first price value auction, which you learned already a lot about, because each person, each of the possible variations they can take on is the same. This is an example where I tweaked the simulation, actually. I wanted to make this exactly perfect, so I manually intervened. And each bidder has a 1/3 chance of being marginal. They have a 1/3 chance of having the highest bid, and they're never going to bid above the second highest bidding price because the bid will end. All right, so to end, I'm going to look at these bidding results again. I'm going to zoom in similar to the conversation. And what we see is here's a subset of the results for ease of visualization. Bidder 3 has a reservation value of 250 and 300 in the columns. Bidder 2, reservation value of 50 and 100. Bidder 1, their full scale of reservation values, making each of these triangles a different clearing price of the auction that is observed in silico in the simulations. And so when we fit auction theory to this, quote unquote, which is that the second highest reservation price should be the clearing price of the auction, it does a really good job predicting what we see. The agents are pretty aligned with auction theory because they don't bid against themselves once they break the highest reservation price, or the second highest reservation price. And when we step back, this is pretty consistent. This is all of the simulations. They're very in line with the theory. Now, you might say you expect that, and you might say you don't, but this is an attempt at beginning to think about a little bit of external validity here. This is what you would want to see. Now, another natural question to ask is, since the theory predicts this, shouldn't the LLM just be able to tell us this? Like, I could have asked Martino that who's going to win, and you're going to easily tell me. So we prompt the LLM with the scenario, and we say, here's the situation. Can you predict what the clearing price of the auction will be? Nope. These are the predictions for each of the different auctions that it makes, the blue lines, kinked at each point. It sometimes decreases the expected clearing price as the reservation values increase. When we look back, the mean squared error is almost 2 orders of magnitude too large. Now, maybe, however, it could learn from self-experimentation. We did all of this work. This is how human social scientists learn. We think we know something about people. We usually are wrong. We run an experiment and we update our model of the world. So we did the same process of prompting the model that we ran the experiments on to predict the clearing price, except we also gave it the fitted DAG with the path estimates. And what we find is these predictions are much better. They're not perfect. The theory's still better, but they're about an order of magnitude better than the predictions without. So we kind of learned this really cool thing here is that the model can learn about itself through self-experimentation. And I know learn about itself is a phrase doing a lot of work, and I don't mean to excessively anthropomorphize. I appreciate that. But merely querying the model, what would happen when you do this, similar to how you might ask a human subject, if I asked everyone in this room to guess how 100 human subjects would play a dictator game, that you would probably all get it very wrong. If you were to really try and predict everyone's results. So stepping back, and 1 minute over, I'll abuse my time. Thinking about this, this could be tools to run your experiments before you run them. But in a perfect, exciting world, if we can make this really good, you can imagine us setting up some sort of system and having it generate thousands of causes and outcomes and exploring them while you sleep and potentially trying to come back with you with new ideas. That would be kind of the big picture future question here. For the sake of time, I'm going to say that the next research questions we're thinking about are trying to chain these experiments together. So, finish the one experiment, run the next one. And then, as others have asked, creating more realistic agents. These were not very realistic. I had the world's simplest hypotheses throughout this process. I acknowledge that, but we think we can get it to be more creative. And then finally, can we figure out when these things are actually going to be good and informative? We know they can be. We know they can also be terrible. We don't have the boundary conditions yet. All right, thank you. Here's the link to one of the papers. Happy to share more. Yes.
Right. So thank you for the talk. You mentioned multiple times that you queried these models, say 100 times for each. But how exactly relevant is that? I mean, it's not clear to me, at least, what we would expect by querying 100 people is that we're getting all of these different facets that would converge to the true result, right? But doesn't it feel like you're querying the same person 100 times? Like how much variability did you find between these different instances of the same model, basically?
I mean, Well, first of all, it is an epistemological question that I don't have a perfect answer to. I'm just going to straight up acknowledge that. But if we go back, oh gosh, if we go back to the price gouging example, you'll see that there were only two options. There were four options. There was completely fair, very unfair. There were four of them. And a lot of times it splits its distribution on two. When you start to look at more continuous questions, you start to get wider distributions. And I think a way to handle this would be to start attempting to tune the temperature to kind of match human subjects data on one sample that you think is representative, and then use that for your kind of out of sample training. So it's a little bit of a heuristic that I think we can kind of just like get around it practically, although I don't have like a perfect theoretical answer for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a lot to digest. I never thought about it, and then you don't. It's difficult to really. It's how to think about it, no? On the one hand, it sort of comes out like, okay, you're gonna just sample like the average quality of the population. It comes out that like I don't know. It'll take me a while to really. I'm sure if I write a marketing model, next time I write a marketing model, I'll run it through your website.
I think
Just for that, it would work for sure.
it is. The open questions are endless, and I don't have answers. I think that it's. I think we will fail often. The possibilities are very.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
A sense of like what are these interesting. I don't know if I want.